Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 48. This is the podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm normally here with Cheatham, but she is out sick today, so we'll be covering this here solo, which is okay. Of all podcast episodes for me to cover solo, this might be a good one just because we're going to do the fourth in our series of Best of 2021. And we're going to talk more specifically today about digital strategy. Now, if you missed episodes 45 through 47, which are the last three episodes we released prior to today, or prior to this week's episode, we covered the people, process, and technology components within each of those best of series. So in episode 45, we covered the people or the change management side of digital strategy and digital transformation. So that episode was sort of the best of the podcast related to organizational change management for the year. Episode number 46 covers business process management, business process mining, process improvement, all that good stuff. That's in episode number 46. And then last week's episode number 47, we covered the technology best of 2021. So everything related to technology, architecture, application selection, infrastructure, that sort of thing. So be sure to check out those episodes if you haven't already, particularly if you're interested in the people, process, and or technology side of things. That best of series is a good one. It covers some of the highlights from the year in each of those areas. And you could argue that today's episode is arguably the most important one because we're talking about digital strategy and none of that other stuff matters. People, process, technology doesn't really matter if you've got the wrong digital strategy. And this is a challenge a lot of organizations have. A lot of companies we work with that hire us to help them define their digital strategies really struggle to find and define agnostically a digital transformation roadmap and strategy that's specific to them, meets their strategic goals and objectives, addresses their priorities, their key needs, takes into consideration their culture, the current environment that they're in. All that stuff is really important to defining a digital strategy that is appropriate for any organization. And one of the challenges with defining digital strategies is that software vendors and system integrators typically will push you or nudge you in a certain direction as you're trying to define your strategy. So, for example, if I'm a SAP or a Microsoft provider, whatever software it is I'm selling, I'm probably going to nudge you in the direction of expanding the footprint or deploying the footprint of my technology as broadly as possible within your organization. And that's human nature. That's what people do when they're trying to sell a product. But we as organizations, when we're defining our digital strategy, need to be more agnostic than that, more independent, more objective, and we need to be more aligned with what our overall goals and objectives are. So it's not enough to say that we want to take a technology-first approach. We need to first define what is it we're trying to accomplish as an organization, what do we want to be when we grow up, and all that good stuff. So that's really the premise of today's conversation and where we wanted to dig in. And today's conversation, we're going to cover a few different things. I'm going to start off by talking about some of the digital strategy trends in the market, a few newsworthy items that we've uncovered over the last few weeks as it relates to digital strategy. And we're also going to feature a few clips from interviews throughout 2021, some of the best of series here related to digital strategy. And the first, after we do the hot topics, the first guest or the first clip we'll play from earlier in this podcast season is from episode 40, and we're going to do a digital strategy client case study with Braden Gerbig from Third Stage Consulting. He's going to talk about the case study for a chemical manufacturer in Latin America that is trying to standardize their operations and needed help defining their digital strategy and roadmap. So we're going to talk to him and play a clip from that extensive interview. We'll play sort of the highlights of that clip shortly after we cover the hot topics here. And then after Braden's on the show later, we're going to talk about human capital management and the human capital digital strategy at an oil and gas client of Third Stages. So this is a company in Asia Pacific, and they were looking to define a digital strategy and roadmap, particularly for their HR technology, their human capital management technologies. And so just another case study, but more focused on the HR and HCM side of things. And then finally, our last clip in today's episode will feature Khalid Morris, who is a director at Third Stage Consulting, similar to Braden, who's the first guest we'll have on today. And Khalid's going to be on the show talking about sports and the science of winning. and how a sports analogy or the way sports teams are coached, the way they execute, the way they game plan, the way they prepare, how all that mentality of athletes in competitive sports teams that are focused on winning, what are some of the lessons we can take from sports when applying those concepts to our digital transformation and our overall digital strategy. So we're going to play you a clip from that. So really good variety of guests here today. Should be a good discussion here today. But before we bring on our guests, there's a few things I wanted to cover from the perspective of recent news or hot topics in the world of digital strategy. And the first one is actually building on something we talked about last week. In our last episode, we talked about how AWS or Amazon Web Services had recently had an outage, a pretty widespread outage in the United States that triggered a bunch of consumer-facing streaming providers and other household names, technology providers, caused them to go down. So, for example, at that time, Netflix was one of the organizations that was affected by the outage. And so we unpacked that a bit in last week's episode, and since we recorded last week's episode, there's been another outage with AWS, and now there's a better understanding of why some of these outages are happening. And in this most recent outage that happened, it was actually on December 15th of 2021 when this most recent one happened at the time we were recording this podcast. There was another AWS outage that caused a number of websites to be down and a number of popular applications to be down as well. So for example, Hulu, DoorDash, PlayStation, QuickBooks were just a few examples of organizations that experienced outages. And these are just the big name household names. I'm sure there's a host of other providers and other mom and pop organizations that rely on AWS for their hosting and cloud infrastructure needs. But this whole thing is a interesting reminder at best that relying on a large cloud provider has its risks. And I think we're seeing more and more of these sort of outages. And while some of these outages are not super long-term, for example, the most recent one on December 15th with AWS was about an hour and a half, that still is considerable. If you're trying to run your operations and you're trying to ship product and conduct financial transactions and take customer orders, whatever the case may be, suddenly your cloud provider goes down, you can't access your systems. What does that do to your operations? And so that's one of the things that you really need to think about when defining your cloud strategy, your overall infrastructure solutions. And what we found in this case, or what we found in our research related to this most recent outage, was that there was some sort of mistake. It was either a technology and or a human mistake in the system that handled network loads. And that was largely what was creating the problems. Now, Amazon hasn't been very specific about what exactly those situations or the challenges were, but what it's clear is that there's a problem that AWS seems to be having with the volume and the scale that it's built over the years. And I guess this may be the early signs that some of these big cloud hosting providers, even they, as massive as they are going to have their weaknesses and their limitations on what they can handle. And it's also a good reminder that you don't have to necessarily rely on a big organization like AWS for your cloud hosting needs. And we talked about this in last week's episode too. If you're looking at AWS, Azure, for example, those are two very popular, very common cloud hosting providers. But there are a ton of second tier and even third tier cloud hosting providers that maybe have more capacity to handle organizations like yourselves. They may have more attention they're able to provide to you as an organization in terms of customer service. So that's some things to think about, is really understanding, how much do you want to concentrate your risk with one of these big technology or cloud providers. And first of all, the first question to ask yourself are there other alternate providers that you could be considering? That's something that a lot of organizations don't think a lot about. They assume that AWS is a big name. It's Amazon. Everyone knows it. We're all comfortable with that name, so that seems like a safe bet. But what we're seeing here is that there are challenges with some of these large hosting providers and large cloud providers. And so the question then becomes, are there better options out there? Are there other providers that can provide service along those lines? Just as an example, in last week's episode, one of our best of on the technology side, we actually covered cloud infrastructure managed services. And the person I interviewed in that discussion was a gentleman named Brad Feeks, who's from a company called Estes Group. And Estes Group is just an example of many, I don't know how many there are, dozens or hundreds, I would imagine, maybe even thousands throughout the world, of mid-size, mid-market sorts of cloud and hosting managed services providers. So, I think doing your due diligence to understand what your options are, what the risks are, what the long-term costs and risks are going to be, long-term business value, all that stuff is really important, and that's something that a lot of times organizations overlook when defining their cloud strategy. So AWS had the outage. It's over now, at least at the time of recording this podcast. We'll just have to keep an eye on that to see if that continues to be a problem for AWS providers in the future. Now, another hot topic within the realm of digital strategy is, and it's also actually related to cybersecurity and outages, but this one that we found is related to Kronos, which is an HCM and payroll system. And Kronos experienced a hack. So the company is called Ultimate Kronos Group, and they I believe it's a merger between two companies, if I remember correctly. It's UPG and Kronos, or Ultimate Software and Kronos, and they merged to create Ultimate Kronos Group. And they suffered a ransomware attack that may keep its systems offline for weeks. And to ensure that employees are paid, customers that rely on the software are working to find backup plans, including ways to issue paper checks, some for the first time in years. So a lot of companies are having to scramble to figure out how they're going to address this fact that their HR and payroll system went down. And again, this is another vulnerability of the cloud. Now all of a sudden, organizations that are using Kronos software and were affected by this hack, they suddenly are at the mercy of the provider, and the fact that there's a vulnerability, and the fact that now they can't run their business because they've outsourced their HR operations and technology needs to a third-party provider. Now, just to give you some context of the types of organizations that were affected by this, there was a lot of large U.S.-based businesses. I don't know if this was a worldwide outage or if it only affected U.S.-based companies, but the big names that we found in our research were U.S.-based companies that were affected by the outage. So organizations such as hospital workers in Texas, public workers in Honolulu, New York's Metro Transportation Authority, University of Utah, George Washington University, I believe Cleveland Clinic, or the city of Cleveland was another example. So a lot of fairly big government and public types of organizations that are now trying to figure out and trying to scramble to pay their employees. And that's a pretty big deal to have an outage like that and all of a sudden have to revert back to your paper processes because you have no choice. It's the only way to keep your operations up and running. So it's not super clear as far as when this hack or when this ransomware situation will be resolved, but again, the timeline that's been outlined in the research we have is that there's weeks involved here, weeks before they can recover and get the systems back up and operating. Now, to be clear, not every Kronos customer was affected by this outage. I believe it was just organizations that were using their private cloud edition of the software. And even there, I don't know, it's not clear to me if it was all the customers using private cloud or just a subset of them. But given the names that were affected, I have to think that there was a lot more organizations that were affected by that outage than we might see on the surface there. So that's the deal with Kronos. So again, another reminder that really having backup plans in place and understanding the risk that when you outsource your technology and your business processes and your operations to a third-party technology provider, there is an absolute risk there that a lot of times organizations don't think about or they take for granted that the cloud providers are going to provide everything they need. Now, the last thing I'll cover here in terms of hot topics for this week as it relates to digital strategy is in the healthcare space. And this is really interesting because I think a lot of us can relate to this, especially if you've tried to go to the doctor or had any sort of healthcare interaction since the pandemic started in 2020. You saw a lot of organizations that were moving towards a virtual healthcare and telehealth sort of model. So, given the pandemic and given the fact that you had a lot of sick people going to doctors, they moved to more of a telehealth model. out of necessity, really. But what we're seeing is that move out of necessity is now triggering a longer term focus on digital transformations within the healthcare space. So telehealth is becoming more and more common. That sort of virtual healthcare model is becoming more common, and it seems to be more permanent than just a temporary pandemic reaction. And so the whole telehealth model seems to be here for a while. But then you're also seeing some merger and acquisition activity in the space that suggests that there's a lot of money chasing this virtual e-health sort of model. And for example, there's a company called Ginger, which is a virtual mental health platform. They merged with another provider called Headspace to provide a merged entity called Headspace Health. And the big advantage that they see in combining forces is that they can use data, big data, and analytics to better support providers. So that's another example of where organizations that are focused on virtual healthcare are consolidating, they're looking for scale, there's money chasing these models, which suggests that there's a lot of optimism around this whole digital transformation space within healthcare in particular. And in addition to that, you had United Healthcare, which is a large healthcare provider that announced the launch of its virtual first health plan, which is called Navigate Now. And this will include round-the-clock access to a care team for primary, urgent, and behavioral healthcare services. And you're seeing more organizations, too, within healthcare moving from a fee-for-service model to a value-based care approach. And this is a really interesting finding for me, and just kind of seeing what's happening in the healthcare space, because we've been involved with healthcare for years now as an organization and as a team, and a lot of our clients are in the space. And historically, digital transformation would focus on EHR, or electronic health records. So really trying to automate and tie together data related to patients and patient care so that you have one source of truth for any types of service that you provide or any type of care you provide to a customer or a patient. And that's still very relevant. So we're seeing systems or software vendors like Epic, for example, is a common EHR platform within the healthcare space. You also have Infor, a cloud suite, which is it's a larger or more broader ERP system that operates in a number of different verticals, but they have a strong presence in healthcare. And those are just two examples, Infor and Epic. And that model is still evolving. I mean, companies are still investing in EHR and trying to automate some of the patient care and healthcare records aspects of their operations. But what you're seeing now is organizations are within the healthcare space are going one step further. Not only are they trying to automate their EHR, their financials, inventory management, supply chain, all that sort of stuff, now they're sort of evolving and moving even further into just changing their entire business models and providing more of a virtual healthcare model. So it's a really interesting, reminder, even if you're not in healthcare, that there are a lot of ways that technology can be used to totally transform or rethink your business model. It's not necessarily just an incremental improvement to automating your current processes and sort of taking baby steps towards new business models. There are organizations out there and even some industries that are seeing a lot bigger quantum leaps towards complete business model evolutions, business model changes. Another real basic and common example that many of you are probably familiar with is within the retail space. Bricks and mortar retailers have sort of been forced due to the pandemic. And by the way, that the trend was actually starting well before the pandemic, but the pandemic really put it into overdrive, that whole trend towards e-commerce and digitization of the customer experience. And so bricks and mortar companies that were dependent on just physical traffic, physical sales within their bricks and mortar stores, they suddenly faced a crisis during the pandemic, especially the early stages when there were lockdowns and shutdowns throughout the world. But what we're seeing is even now, even after the pandemic is starting to ease and countries and different parts of the world are starting to reopen or continuing to reopen and continuing to ease social distancing and whatnot and put less restriction on trade, even in those cases, you're still seeing retailers make more of a permanent tectonic shift towards this e-commerce model, providing a better customer experience in a digital way. And so, again, a good reminder that regardless of what industry you're in, its chances are pretty high that either technology and or external macro customer forces are going to force you to move in that direction, whether you like it or not. One last thing I'll mention is a lot of what we talked about earlier was related to Amazon. When we were talking about AWS in the opening segment or at the beginning of this segment. And speaking of Amazon, Amazon is a retailer that a lot of people at the consumer individual level are comfortable with and used to. And what we're seeing is that people that work at home or shop from home, they'll shop Amazon for their personal lives. They are expecting a similar type of experience in their business or professional lives. So even if you're a B2B seller of products or services, chances are you're going to be affected by the fact that Amazon is disrupting the business to consumer retail space. Even though if you're B2B, you're still going to be affected by the fact that Amazon is having that sort of disruption because people's expectations have changed, people's comfort levels with old dated technologies has changed, and people just expect the opportunity to be able to interact and provide more of a digital touch point with your organization. So when defining your digital strategy, which is the whole theme of today's episode, it's really important to think about ways we can change our business models, ways we can increase or improve the customer experience, and ways that we can really leverage technology and digitization to make our business models stronger and better.